Stop the Week with Robert Robinson.
Hello. Our conversation this evening comes from Sarah Harrison, the novelist, Dr. Michael O'Donnell, the writer, Edward Blishen, the author, and Laurie Taylor, Professor of Sociology at York University. Music from Jeremy Nicholas. Now, I've got an interesting note here from Senor Joseph Salvador of Castellar del Vallès, Barcelona. That's enough accent. I'll just say it ordinarily now. Senor Salvador is a student of English, and he says, I have not had one single minute of boredom listening to your delightful programme. Well, perhaps a somewhat negative way of approaching the thing. But Senor Salvador adds very politely, if I should be disturbing you, you can always chuckle this letter away. Well, I wouldn't dream of chuckling it away, especially since Senor Salvador says he admires my own style of speaking. But it was only today, he says, that I learned that you are a general, and this explains much. Well, it certainly explained why he began the letter, Dear General Robinson. It slightly puzzled me, but it's clear that Mr. Marmaduke Hussey's first act on taking over the chairmanship of the BBC has been to put the place on a war footing, and my promotion from second lieutenant was long overdue. Now, if you keep your noses clean, I'll see what I can do about having you all made up to corporal, but it's got to be clearly understood on parade, on parade. Now, what should we talk about? Yes. That bishop who seemed to think the phrase having a bit on the side was a synonym for being jolly good pals with someone. Apart from the locution being one of the most jarring and disagreeable in the whole of the demotic, I feel a spasm of irritation to find a grown man so culpably ignorant. It's part of the adult state to know what your fellow man is talking about, and it's hideously patronising to ape those parts of the English language which used to be called slang, as though it were the dialect of an inferior tribe. Clergymen can still be heard doing it on Thought for the Day. I don't think it's called Thought for the Day anymore, but they can be still heard doing it. It's known as blokiness. Slang isn't a separate lingo you learn. You just don't do that. You absorb it as you absorb the rest of the language. How, don't you say? Don't you agree?
How much slang do you use, I wonder? Because isn't the fact that...
Never notice it, you see.
For example, if one talked about something like being drunk, and thought of all the ways that were to describe being drunk, probably you would object to almost all of them on the grounds that drunk conveyed the meaning, and to talk about being stewed or to be being canned or to be being bevied or anything like that would suggest really here was a person...
You're really, I have to say this, that you can say stewed, canned, or all those silly words, so long as you are evidently on intimate terms with those words, so long as they're part of you, so long as they're, more than a simple tattoo on your arm.
But isn't the fact, I just want to say just the second part of this, is because so many of these words shade into what we think of as euphemisms, as you're already indicating. We don't want to be caught speaking a euphemism. And a lot of those things are ways... No, but I mean, many of the words which feature as slang are in fact ways of not saying directly what should be said.
Oh, a bit on the side is a waggish way of saying I'm a man of the world and describing whatever the activity might turn out to be. So, no, I don't wholly agree with you, but we'll get back to it, I bet.
Well, a slang may come naturally to you, Bob. The problem is that the wrong slang may come naturally to you. I can remember my children, my sons, when they were small, taking me aside and asking me never again in company to talk about a delightful event being a lark. Now, I wasn't actually in the 20s when I grew up, a lark, I mean, so even to me now, if you promise me a lark, my blood... my temperature rises.
What did they object to, Edward?
Well, because it was out of date. My grandson, Sam, 9 this weekend, has, I've noticed, a sequence, yes, of course, a sequence, I promised him to say that, but it has a sequence of words for good. I think the latest is X, which I believe is short for excellent, but I dare not use that because he gives me a very cold look.
You see, you're behaving rather a bit like the bishop, a bit like the judges who say, who is Mickey Mouse? You're behaving as though you're unhandy handy in this lingua franca. I say to you that there is no longer any distinction between ordinary language and slang, and everyone uses it. More of that, I
don't think Edward should pay any attention to his children. I hope you didn't. I'm rather on the side of the judge. I liked it earlier this year when the British Medical Association newsletter, which is having complicated committee elections at different stages, produced its headline, "First Leg Over in Election" was its headline. And I rather liked that. I mean, just as I liked it with the Bishop. I think the sort of blokiness that I dislike, it falls into two categories. There's a saloon bar slang, where it does come naturally, it'd be all right on the night, better out than in, but it's delivered as though this was newly minted by the speaker. That's what I dislike about it. The other sort is even worse. I bet you next week at the Tory party conference we will get a cut-class voice referring to a job of work. And it reminds me of when I was a child. I remember a chap used to recite Kipling to us. It's Tommy this and Tommy that. And again, in a rather grand middle-class voice and all the ums and ers that are written into were all enunciated perfectly. And the films I saw as a child in the 50s and the 40s never had working-class accents. They had Stanley Holloway and Joyce Grenfell putting on funny accents, but revealing all the time they were really ladies and gentlemen behind them. Now, that's the sort of blokiness that I dislike.
Yeah, and because it's a display of confidence, when it goes wrong, it rumbles the whole premise on which the remark is based. I mean, the wretched Bishop's gaffe was akin to that of the tennis player who leaps lightly over the net, shake hands with his opponent, and just tips the edge of the net and crashes on his face in front of everybody. But we should differentiate perhaps between slang and jargon. You see, both are tribal. It seems to me they're designed to make the members of the tribe obviously recognisable and comprehensible to one another and to exclude non-members. And jargon seems to divide us as a group vertically into sort of work and professional tribes. And then slang divides horizontal and diagonally into dozens of different subdivisions. And of course it's possible to belong to several different, what one might refer to as slang gangs. And you hear all sorts of complex juxtapositions to convey certain nuances, like the awful and very brief "cheers, mate," which you hear people saying to the cabbie as they get out of taxis.
No, I think you've misheard it. It's only the one word, C-H-I-Z. I refuse to pronounce it because it's very often pronounced by people who aren't entitled to.
Absolutely.
I repeat what I said to Laurie earlier. If you're on intimate terms with the words that you use, and it doesn't matter whether it be slang or colloquialism or the most, what shall I say, structured way of talking or writing, it's all right. But otherwise, you're trying to pass yourself off as someone you aren't.
You're suggesting that you can somehow come to be on intimate terms with these words, but there seem to be certain phrases which resist any coming to terms with. I mean, when I go to America, the possibility of saying "sunny side up" or eggs over easy, it would seem to me that I could live there for 25 years and have eggs for breakfast every single day, in the same way that I could go into pubs and drink ice with my whiskey and never say "on the rocks."
Yeah, very
because
difficult.
These phrases are, as Sarah's indicated, like membership statements. But one of the other, there are so many different sorts of slang, and perhaps it's a tiny bit of a pity that the book that we're referring to.
Well, we haven't made it at all clear. We're talking
which we're
about the
drawing
Bishop.
upon.
There is, but I'll just make it clear now, if you'll allow me to discharge the chairman's function. I should have done it before. Oh dear, how dreadful. It's a book of slang, a thesaurus of slang, which of course is a contradiction in terms, because you certainly, an ordinary thesaurus is a sort of reach-me-down of alternatives, which if you need it, you reach into. But you can't reach into a thesaurus of slang, because it's either said or it's not said.
I was just going to just add one thing, that there are so many divisions in here. One division that we just haven't mentioned is the fact that slang is the only way of talking about certain things. There are no other words. So in many cases, if you're talking about bodily fluids, about certain drug experiences, it's almost that nobody has actually the vocabulary which exists in those areas, and it has been made up.
But
so when
you, Laurie, do you really think that slang is a separate aspect or section of language? I do not. I think it's all one.
But I must come to
I see you're going to think about it.
I must come to the aid of the chap here. I mean, I absolutely agree with what you say about this dictionary. He calls it a reverse dictionary. That is, you think of a formal word, he says, and then you think to yourself, my goodness, I wonder what the slang for that is, which, of course, is how he justifies it. But it is a terribly unnatural thing. One can't imagine anybody thinking to himself, "You are a tiresome person." I won't say that. I wonder how I say it if I were black or I were an Australian or something of that nature. So it's all very odd. But the whole business of dictionaries, you see, interests me, because I don't see quite how we can have the innocent view of slang, or many of us can have the innocent view that you suggest. For example, lately I came into the possession of that great, fat, lovely lovely book, Partridge's Dictionary of Slang and Unconventional English. Now, as somebody who, when we have dinner, I cannot but look things up. So somebody, when we have dinner, says, I'm cheesed off. So immediately I go off and
ruin the dinner party.
I ruin the dinner. Our dinners end
I've got a book here, you say.
Our dinners end
Just a moment, just a moment.
The table...
Do go on eating.
The dinner table ends up with more dictionaries than dishes. I realise this is an awful thing. Oh, yes. Oh, come, yes, of course, some people say we won't go to the Blishens for dinner again. There's all those bloody dictionaries. But all the same, the fact remains, if he says cheesed off, I know that in the next room I have the reference book which will answer the very interesting question. Oh, Bob, you would be just the same.
Resist it, Edward. Resist it altogether. Oh, reform it altogether.
Can I take up what Laurie was saying about the bodily fluids and parts of the body? There are only
I didn't know what he was talking
slang
about.
I mean, it's very interesting looking in the index of this book because it is a sort of, there are some sporty phrases all the way through it, and sticking out in the middle of it is female pudendum, and it does stick out, if you'll pardon the expression, rather like a sore thumb. Now, and it's the wrong. That's in the index. It's a bit like that tale of the chap in court who described, we went down the effing road and we went behind the effing hedge and I did it, and then what happened? Intimacy took place.
It struck me that, looking at this, that slang is terribly male-orientated. You mentioned the poor old female pudendum. They may well have been sticking out, but can I say that the male genitals had 2 whole columns? And not only that, but promiscuous females had 30 terms, promiscuous males only 6, attractive women 76, attractive man 7, and so on and so forth. I could go on. And as for these things about pregnancy, I mean, they were all terms for spoiling the fun and letting the poor old male down. There were 29 of them.
Well,
the miracle of birth had only one. Blessed event. Blessed event.
Well, look, one of the things that I hope Mr. Hussey is going to look into, and I'm sure he's not the man to leave it undone, is the way that BBC ladies are terribly susceptible to the low colloquialism. We'll all remember the times. It's gone now, thank God. The epidemic is gone. When you couldn't go into a television studio for the number of females in designer jeans who were using the phrase hang about. Hang about, they said. Now, of course, Hussey will be going into that. He'll be going into the other awful error, you see, because what these females are trying to do is to prove that they're one of the boys. That's different from being male or female. They're proving they're one of the boys. They also use, to this very day, the 2 phrases have it away and have it off, as though they were synonymous. I call this a grotesque error, and that approach is... I won't go on with my theme at the moment, but I'll pick it up in a minute.
You're asking for more context to explain when these should be used, and that's exactly right, because it's so difficult when these words come across. You know when someone has insulted you correctly. You know that at the moment when you've been in your car and you've done something and someone catches up with you and leans out and says, dickhead, or something like that to you, you think, oh, God, he got it absolutely right, that they hit the words. So when you come across words of abuse here like scab face or scum sucker or knucklehead or toe rag or jobsworth, it is knowing the precise moment, the exact degree of ineptitude that has been shown by the person who at the moment merits the abuse, but to get that word spot on.
But this sort of speech is not separate to one tribe or separate from the normal body of speech. My contention is that it's now all one, and we can no longer afford, as Edward's about to do yet again, to claim that he doesn't know who Mickey Mouse is.
No.
So he'll be saying, what does court chase me round? My Aunt Fanny round the gas
again on one of these occasions, you set me up as yourself and you knock me down. Honestly, because I know you do... You have just been claiming, in an unnatural way, for spontaneity in the use of slang, and then I hear you being a pedant, like myself, about the difference between have it off and have it away. That is pure pedantry. You are naturally a pedant, and there is absolutely no way...
I'm for accuracy, whether it be what used to be called slang, because it's not really called slang anymore.
But your natural, easy user of slang is not for accuracy. He is for raciness. But I think there is another field in which it's important to look at slang, because in some fields, for example, the field of sex, it's quite clear that slang offers a more suitable language than the formal language. What I'm impressed by here, my wife used to, I seem to be bringing all my family into it, but I think I've not got my wife into it before, but she used to go into school by invitation and talk about sex. And one of the first things she felt necessary to do was to get from the kids the words with which they were able to discuss
Couldn't
sex.
she guess them?
No, she knew them, but it was necessary to have them formally on the board, and she always had to remind herself to clean the board before she left the room.
You see, I knew you'd do. I knew you were going to say something like that.
Bill.
A marvellous instance. My old housemaster. Curl up and fall asleep while I tell you this, but my old housemaster told me there was, during the war, a young lady, because all the masters were away at the war, and so he had young ladies there, and a lady came in and used a very rude word, quoted it to Peter, my housemaster, and she said, have you heard that word before? And he said, yes, Phyllis, I have. And she said, what does it mean? And he said, well, of course it's a term referring to the anatomy, but it's also a term of scornful or contemptuous abuse. And she said, oh, that's what the man meant when he said that to Eric when he kicked over the vases in Peter Jones. The point being this, because my housemaster was always one for underlining a moral, he said he thought it was unforgivable in a grown-up person not to know all those words, if only he added to avoid them.
I find it slightly disconcerting to see a lot of this written down in words. I mean, I wondered about something. I mean, how does he know that nookie is spelt I-E and not Y? I think he is imposing things upon it. I mean, it is an erudite book. I was delighted to discover that lunchtime intercourse is funch. I thought that was rather nice.
Yes.
But through the book, I felt slightly disturbed all the time that it was written down. It seemed to me that these were phrases that should be flung off across a crowded room and not studied and grouped together.
Michael, I must defend the chap. He said his claim is that, in fact, all the slang he has here is in use at the moment. Some of it is absolutely up to date, and some of it has lasted a long time.
Then you can't have read it. I have, and it isn't.
I have indeed. Oh, yes.
I mean, dip your bill. I've got some written down here.
No, I can't do
it. Well, ducks, I'd put together a sentence. I think back to Senor Salvador, who wrote me that letter, and he's learning English. If he studies this book, he might come up with a sentence, well, ducks, he went down the battle cruiser to dip his bill, and honest Injun, when did you last hear anyone say that? When he got back, he was skew whiff or 3 sheets in the wind, core striker light. The following morning, it was a case of Joe
If my sons had not spoken severely to me, I would speak almost continuously in those terms.
In that case, they're doing a public service. We're now going to do a public service by insisting that Jeremy sing us a song. Oh, dear, I have the gravest forebodings. It's called Dicky Birds.
Now, Brian was a cockney lad, all right, and he loved a bit of bother and he loved to have a fight. He liked his pint of bitter and a game of darts and parading down the high street with a couple of tarts. Brian was a proper little Jack the lad, and Lord, oh, love me, all the laughs we had. The only trouble was that whenever we went out, I couldn't understand what he was going on about. Then one night Brian said, come here and listen carefully, and I'll explain the Dicky Birds just like the ABC. First you get your whistle on and Limehouse Blues, or in other words, get out your suit and shoes, your Peckham, and then your Burlington and Tilbury docks. That's a tie and shirt and then a pair of socks. Putting on your weasel or your cul-de-sac, depending on the weather, it's a coat or Mac. Leave your Mickey Mouse and start the old jam jar. That means you leave the house and clamber in the car. You can always get a flounder or the Oxo cube, or jump on the square and cuss. Meaning if you find you're short of sausages or Oscar, you can always catch the bus. Thank you, Brian, I said. That's grand. I want to speak so nobody will understand. You give it lots of bunny, you're away with words. I can see it's very useful when you're chatting up the birds. Please now, Brian, I've got the hang. Give me more examples of your rhyming slang. But Brian often cheated and occasionally lied, and Brian did a little bit of thieving on the side. Just as the police arrested him, he gave me some advice, which, considering the situation, really was quite nice. Every morning wash your hair and clean your teeth. In other words, your bonnet and your Hampstead Heath. Don't put your money on the cards or races, meaning on the Wilkies or the Airs and Graces. Never try to drink and drive when you are tiddly. Mustn't ever high dive when you're Armstrong Sidley. Be kind. To the family, the wife and kids, the trouble and strife and all the saucepan lids. As you toddle up the apples and the pears at night with your cup of rosy lee, be grateful that you're not a cockney villain or you might have ended up like me. Be grateful that you're not a cockney villain or you might have ended up like me.
Well, I think Cockney rhyming slang's perfectly all right when set to wonderful music by Jeremy there, but you know, it's actually, no one's ever spoken it on land or sea except those people on the telly who write the comedy shows, and you couldn't go into a pub within a 5-mile radius of the Bow Road without hearing all the people not talking their own native lingo, but actually imitating Arthur and his minder. Oh, I shouldn't have got that one in after the subject's well closed. I just want to ask you this. I don't know really how familiar you all are with the early Middle English text, the Ancrona Wissa. I caught Sarah's eye and thought she might be. Anyway, it doesn't really matter. It's not a racy read. Dealing as it does, in withering detail, let it be said, with how to be a good nun. Indeed, humanity doesn't break through till the very last line when the geezer who'd been detailed off to write all this stuff down signs off with the words, "May well he over God hit wit, do me toward Rome, then for to begin and hit eft for to done. I'd sooner walk barefoot to Rome than do this again." And I may say those were my exact feelings when sitting across the table from someone who ought to have known better, who said, "Isn't Mozart dreadful? So empty." Now, where do you begin? The correction of such a stupefying error is surely the exact image of the impossible task. To, as it were, reach back into your own assumptions that have remained undisturbed for years, and from the ground up, do your best to construct Mozart before this man's very eyes. Doesn't the stoutest heart quail? And yet, it must be done. However falteringly, the task cannot be avoided. If you duck out by looking at your watch and say, "Hey, I must lep. Mabel said 6:30. You will feel cheap for days. Not only will Mozart be thinking, "Fine friend he turns out to be," you too will have a sneaking suspicion that you didn't do your duty because you weren't quite sure how to do it, that your conviction of Mozart's supremacy isn't quite matched by your ability to say why. Well, I fumbled away a bit like a man with one arm trying to thread a needle, and the chap said, "Yeah, well, see what you mean. Still think he's lousy," and left before I was reduced, of course, to my fallback position, namely straightforward vulgar abuse. You aren't always obliged to explain the obvious, but now and again you simply have to try. But isn't it damned hard work?
I think there are two things which make it hard work. One is that we do spend so much of our time in a yay-saying group, and people go around agreeing all the time with each other, that is our natural, almost our natural form of existence. And secondly, that arguments so often, because you are being invited there to start an argument from the very bottom of the ladder.
Absolutely.
You're standing on the ground. Now, most arguments start from 2/3 of the way up, in which someone you know well says, "I don't care what you say, I think that sort of D.H. Lawrence was sexist." Now, you have been all up and down the steps of this argument. You know exactly where to go in, you know where it started. And indeed, in that TV series called Couples Arguing, there was even time to send for the TV crew to come round and film the actual argument. It was so well known. So for those reasons, I think this is an odd situation.
Well, it's very difficult. It doesn't happen very often. But I just hope that someone will agree with me that you want, when it is produced, you are being challenged to say, "OK, you tell me why God's all right, or tell me why God isn't all right, or Mozart, or Shakespeare, or Sir Christopher Wren," that it's jolly difficult.
Can I just say, this may sound like stating the obvious, but it does depend on who makes this challenge. For instance, there are some people who seem to set the standard. Now, we're assuming in this story that you tell, Bob, that this person was quite beyond the pale and a Philistine, and you knew him for what he was.
No,
and
ought
you set eyes
to
on
have known
him.
better is what I said.
Oh, fair enough. OK. But I can picture a scenario, for instance, where you made a remark like this, and I would immediately agree with you, because I would automatically assume that you set this standard and I must be wrong. Now, I think there are people who go around life feeling that they're always wrong.
Well, if I said Shakespeare wrote in Chinese, surely it would challenge that.
Well, that is slightly different, to be fair. That is not a question of taste, that's a lie. But shall we say, have you never done this yourself? Have you never sat at a party where you felt everybody was patting each other on the back, and that the awful miasma of clickiness and agreement was closing in on you, and just for the hell of it, you threw up one of those? And does that sort of mischief
come
make
back
you
to that,
really
because Edward has yet to speak. Interesting
but of course,
point.
there
there are circumstances in which it's absolutely true there is no arguing about taste. I mean, fundamentally, that may be a question where the argument, where the whole business, and what you have to set up there, in the case of Mozart, probably is a 12-session series of seminars and so on. But I can remember a curious example of this some years ago when Antonioni's film of Death in Venice was going the rounds. Now, we hated it. I mean, my family, which I've mentioned before. It's true that we saw it in the company of an absolutely delightfully blunt girl from the north who, when we were watching, slipped out every now and then for a chocolate or to go to the loo, and she'd come back and say, "Have I missed out?" Well, as far as we were concerned, it's become a catchphrase in our family because we thought she'd missed nothing very much, except the camera once again making a long survey of a hotel room full of faces, or again a long inspection of the Lido at Venice. And it seemed to us very precious, the film, and a betrayal of the Thomas Mann story, just to show that we're serious about it. But we discovered that if we said this to friends, one of two things would happen. They'd either express enormous relief at meeting someone else who thought like that, or they became very haughty and cold and hurt, and that happened even with the best of friends. And it seemed to me, a matter in which people felt their whole reputations were at stake, and that sometimes may happen in this case.
Yes.
One way you were being judged to be a Philistine, and the other way you were being judged to be simply a sucker for portentous and precious films.
Right.
There appeared to be no way out of that one.
How much is at stake is important, and it relates to what you were saying about who it is that you're talking to at the time. And if you mistake one, then you get the other wrong. Because coming out of the cinema the other night, you remind me of coming out of the screen in Baker Street into a place you're expelled out into a little arena where they sell carrot cake, a very tiny arena. I came out about 11 o'clock after seeing Hannah and her sisters, and there was someone I knew from the BBC standing with a tape recorder. So I said, hello, what are you here for? He said, I'm here to record some people arriving for the Rocky Horror Picture Show to talk about them. So I said, oh yes. And the woman, he introduced the woman that he was with and said, this is so-and-so. I didn't quite catch her name or bother to listen because I was on my way out. And she said, what did you think of the film? I said, well, all right, not much. I mean, okay, a bit overrated. And I just threw away a few remarks the way that you do when you meet someone casually in a bar and you're on your way out. She said, oh dear, she said, what a terrible thing, she said, because I recommended it to so many people. I said, well, I'm sure, they'll like it. I said, but, how many people? She said, well, I don't know exactly. She said, all the readers of the Daily Telegraph. I'm the film critic. And I suddenly thought, oh, God. I said, well. And I'd heard myself saying before, not too bad, all right, bit pretentious.
But you see, what Sarah says, and what Edward and yourself have also said, is to illustrate that we are very careful when we lob in this joke. Like, I suspect your North Country friend, have I missed out? I like to think there's a vestige of inverted commas around that. However, I don't know. We can very carefully pick the... what about the actors? The other night, doing that long play, I think, by Sophocles, and I either read or one of the actors told me that when one of the main performer said, oh, shall I just do that speech again? The whole of the Greek chorus said, oh, no, something like that. They could joke about Sophocles and the Greek drama because we're all allowed to. The other week, I was speaking to Stephen Oliver and in a mood just to lob in one of those little time bombs that you spoke of, Sarah. I said, isn't Wagner rather like you're invited along for 5 hours to stave off an orgasm, and then you're invited back the next night to do the same? And I was gratified to see that the steam rose from his head. Now, we all know that you don't exactly get chucked out of the brownies for saying that. You aren't exactly categorized as a Philistine. But there comes a moment, and whether it be God or whether it be Mozart or whether it be Shakespeare, Mozart protects us. I'll tell you why. Because he approximates to the absolute. The absolute must be protected by us, because if we allow it not to be, it is as though the sundials and all the ways of telling the time, all the ways of saying who you are, have vanished. So we should protect Mozart. I'm not saying there are many artists or institutions or individuals that we have to do this for.
If you aim just below the absolute, I think there are two circumstances in which I think it's quite justifiable to pull out. I think very often the challenge is phrased in the wrong terms. I mean, the thing that happens to me very often is people say, do you believe in... as our man from East Moseley asked me, and do you believe in copper bracelets for arthritis? Now, you have again to have seminars, because it's not a matter of... I mean, the only answer which I gave to him was, I have arthritis and I don't wear one. I think that's fair. There is another occasion when I think it's fair to duck out, and that is there are some things that are sources of anger to me. And I don't want to go through the evidence again because it generates a fury in me.
Well, I'm interested in what Michael said about anger associated with all this, because one thing I think that's quite devastating is when people say this sort of thing with no element whatever of debate in their voices. There is nothing remotely tentative about it, and you're even for a moment made deeply uneasy because the conviction with which they speak suggests the absolute opposite of the world in which you live and the possibility that their world is the real one. I must refer to a member of my family again, my father here, my father, because my father had the enormous gift of suggesting that his opinions were the only possible opinions. So that when my father said Bach was rubbish and Shakespeare was rubbish, you were aware of a terrible possibility that he was right. Or rather, not that he was right, but this was a world in which we lived, in which only that opinion had any relevance. You yourself had got into some absurd annex of the world, and there was no future in that annex. Not that you agreed with his opinions, but you were taken aback by the sheer vigour and vehemence of their expression. And what I think may be going on is that the division is not between those who hold one view and another, but between those who have a habit of totally assured statement, absolutely assured.
What about people, those who have, and here I come to the confessional, a proselytizing streak? Now, as a fresh-faced youth touring America with the Ouds from the university, hitching a ride from Normal, Illinois to Burlington, Indiana, just a group of us, just to have a look at the Mississippi. Never seen it before, then we saw it, and we hitched a ride back, and we got into a great big Pantechnicon with the truck driver. He said, "What are you doing?" And we said, "Oh, we're doing this Shakespeare play." And he said, "Shakespeare, bullshit." Whereupon I launched into the sort of lecture that only the fresh-faced, scarcely shaved youth would tip out over complete strangers. And at the end of it, one of the girls in the group said, "Well, I didn't know you had it in you." She knows I have it in me because she's now my wife, and she knows that I cannot resist that sort of argument, even though it's bending down to pick up sixpence. Some people are like that.
What about the peculiar fact that if you avoid one argument, you say, "No, I'm not going to pick this up, I'm not going to go that way," then in fact you get yourself into a worse situation entirely, because you then run into the next argument. And about a year ago, I was at some sort of dinner party, and I was next to a lady, and I started talking to her, and she said, "I understand that you're a criminologist." And I said, well, yes, I am. She said, "Don't you think that capital punishment should come back?" And I thought, no, I'm going to duck this one.
At least she put it in the question.
I said, well, I know. She said, because some friends of ours were burgled recently, and I muttered something about, well, not perhaps capital punishment for burglary or something. And she said, "What about terrorists? What can be done about them?" And I said, well, I don't really know what can be. She said, "Shouldn't they be sort of shot or something done?" And I thought, no, I'm going to duck this one as well. So I said, well, I don't know. I said, it's something to do with solving the Palestinian question. If that was solved, I said weakly, maybe there wouldn't be so much terrorism around. She said, she said, "Now there," she said, "I agree with you entirely." She said, "Something must be done for the Palestinians," she said, "because the Palestinians," she said, "have been denied their homeland." And I thought, oh, good, well, perhaps we can have a consensual conversation about this. And she suddenly said, "I mean, why do the Jews want any more space when they've got so much in Leeds?"
But you see, this you can avoid. There's only once that someone comes up and tries to murder Mozart. And really, if he's doing it for a joke like we might do about Sophocles, or at least I might just try it doesn't matter. But the person I'm talking about actually meant all he said. But that doesn't often happen. Other people come along. No, the woman who spoke to you was in deadly earnest, deadly seriousness. Other people come along when they're slightly drunk and they say things like, "Can't stand Woody Allen," right? As though you're just going to say, "Bishop of Durham, doesn't he make you want to weep?" Pavarotti couldn't hold a candle to Mario Lanza. And now, this is where I stand. Alas, all you need to do politely is say, "Oh, I'll just get you another drink. You see, your glass is empty." You go. I've never been able, constitutionally, I've never been able to say the words, "I dare say you're probably right," unless I actually mean it. And as a consequence, I've been up so many conversational cul-de-sacs. And as I say that, I do rather hope this hasn't been one.
Sarah Harrison, Dr. Michael O'Donnell, Edward Blishen and Professor Laurie Taylor were stopping the week with Robert Robinson. Jeremy Nicholas provided the musical interlude, and the programme was produced by Michael Ember.